Okay, great everyone. So today marks the first in our series of weekly article reviews on the CyberJA show, and I'm indeed excited about what is to unfold in the coming weeks. So we'll be covering a number of topics across the GRC and the cyber space. So the aim is for us cybersecurity professionals to develop a stronger understanding and also the appreciation of business and how it aligns with cybersecurity, vice versa. And to kick things off for this week, then we are joined by Chris Carter, board chairman, cyber risk advisor, and many more, titles that he can definitely share with us as we go along. So, Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Sure, my friend. And indeed, I'm excited for what is to unfold from this discussion. Now, we're going to be dissecting a recent article published in the Financial Times, the cyber attacks said to become uninsurable, says Zurich chief. That's the article. I know that many of you would have read that article. You would have heard about this article um, in some form or the next. But just before I ask Chris to share on this article, something very interesting actually jumped out at me while looking at the article, and it's the fact that the subject of risk actually pops out. And this has to do with the fact that there are several types of risk treatments that many persons who are involved in the dealing with risk within organization that organizations can actually use to manage various risks within organization in terms of risk treatment, right? And a number of ways to actually treat risk in terms of risk avoidance, risk mitigation, risk transfer, and the list goes on. And looking at this article talking about cyber attacks becoming uninsurable, then from this, then transferring risk to an insurance company might now become a challenge. So for me, this is definitely interesting times ahead for many organizations. And that is just a thought for you to ponder as we go through this conversation. So Chris, take us through this article, sharing your thoughts, your insights um, as it relates to this particular article.
Sure. So again, I'm very excited to be here and to be talking about this topic. In full transparency, I did work for Zurich for almost 10 years. I did work under Mario Greco, who was featured in the article. And a couple of things before we get started. Like you mentioned, risk. When it comes to risk, organizations have roughly four different options. As you mentioned, you could remediate the risk, you can transfer the risk, you can avoid the risk, or you can. The fourth one is slipping me, right? But uh, as far as an insurance company is concerned, they don't make a product. They own. They don't make a product. They basically promise their customers that they're going to protect them, right? So that's where they take on the risk, and they say, you transfer this risk over to us, we'll manage it in the event of a unlikely or catastrophic event. We will take care of that risk for you. So for a risk, right, an insurer,
Chris,
let's say,
Chris, can you just check your camera? You think your camera is off?
sure, I did turn it off because I heard some echo, but I'll come back
No,
on.
it's fine.
But yeah, so for an insurance company to say, you know what, we're probably not going to be in the business of underwriting cyber risk, that there's a lot of implications there, right? And before we go into the implications, we have to understand that insurance companies generally don't make money um, by insuring. What they do is They take your money and then they invest the money. And normally they measure. They have one key, I would say, performance indicator that indicate whether they're successful or not. And that's what they call their combined ratio. So the lower the combined ratio, the better it is for the insurance company. So what he's saying is, if we take a look at our combined ratio, we don't think we're going to make money. Our combined ratio is going to go up, right? So what does that mean for organizations that carry cyber risk? How do they go about de-risking a specific scenario or de-risking the overall business? Um, right. So as we said before, uh, we have when we talk about how you treat a risk, you now potentially in a scenario you've now removed the option of transferring the risk, right? So what does that mean? You're either going to have to avoid the risk, mitigate the risk, or accept the risk, right? uh, if you avoid the risk, that means you're probably no longer going to be in business. Most companies want to stay in business, so now they have two options. They're either going to accept the risk or they're going to remediate the risk, right? Accepting if a risk is such that the likelihood and the impact are both high, chances are they're now left with one option, and that is to remediate the risk, right? So they're not going to avoid the risk. They can't accept the risk, so now they have to remediate the risk, right? So obviously they have a risk framework. They're going to have to go deep into that risk framework, and they're going to have to look at those controls, right? Whether it's uh, from a compliance perspective or risk perspective, which means I think if Mario's prediction holds up, that's actually a good thing for the cyber industry because you're going to see improved capabilities around managing cyber risk, reducing the attack surface, and CISOs having a much more prominent role at the table when it comes to make risk decisions, right? Um, if we go back to we put the option back on the table of transferring the risk. What we're seeing insurance companies do is they're starting to up the ante. So, for example, before they underwrite a risk, they're going to say, well, do you have the basic cyber hygienes in place? Do you have multi-factor authentication? What are controls that you have that would lessen the likelihood of this risk occurring, right? So we'll manage the impact, but we also want to make sure that the likelihood uh, of a risk event occurring should fall to an acceptable level, not only on the risk owner's perspective, but on the potential insurance carrier. So there are a lot of implications, but I think again, if we were to go down the path of saying, you know, uh, of carriers saying we're no longer going to insure or take on risk, then the organization is left with very few options. And they could be expensive, they could be innovative, um, they could be challenging, but I think overall this is a good thing. I hate to make predictions because people who predict are usually wrong, but I would assume that it's safe to say that governments will also step in. They will either take on, uh, you know, that transfer, or they'll implement. I mean, since the Trump administration, we've seen a much more aggressive um, posture from the government when it comes to cyber risk requirements, regulations, and things like that. So I think overall, I'm excited by this article. It's a little bit scary, but I think it's a positive. And Mario, knowing Mario, I think this article is probably driven by a book he read by Nicole Perlroth. It's called "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends," and he read it in a couple weeks, if not days. Right? He was so enamored by the book, it opened his eyes, and I think it's telling because as non-cyber executives understand the importance of addressing, um, of understanding, of treating a risk, the more they understand the implications, I think the better it is, not only for the organizations, but for people in general. Because as he mentioned in the article, he brought up a few doomsday scenarios where he said, lives could be at risk, and they could be, right? So I'm excited about the article, and I hope other carriers, as well as business owners, business leaders, start to understand the implications of what he's saying, because they're far reaching, and the consequences or the pluses are actually far reaching.
Yeah, sure. Thinking about all that you have said as it relates to the pros and the cons, in terms of the cyber risk and the treatment. 'Cause one of the things is that persons will say that, I mean, insurance companies, they have some of the greatest minds when in terms of the necessary predictions and the actuaries to ensure that whatever liabilities they do take on in terms of providing that sort of security or guarantee to organization should be at a level whereby it doesn't matter what the risk that an organization faces, then they should be in a position to cushion or absorb this sort of risk for organizations. So when, for example, my company or some organization um, decide to make that investment and then being told that, hey, look, based on what is happening in the industry, on the rise of cyber attacks and all of these things, look, we are unable to provide that level of coverage. Then the next step is, what do we as organizations do? What measures do we put in place to help to safeguard us, to help us to keep operating in light of maybe this impending doom, as they would say?
Yeah. It's a great point, and I think what we'll start seeing, and it really depends on the industry or the vertical that you're operating within. I think we will start seeing an increased shift away from compliance to risk, right? From so looking at it, unless you're in the healthcare sector or the financial sector, you're always going to be beholden to compliance. And regulations, right? But I think at the very the substance of it is, folks are going to start looking at the issue from a risk perspective. So having a more risk based conversation about how we enable business processes, I think that's going to start becoming more and more prominent at the table when we see business decision makers making decisions, right? I think you'll see the fundamentals around how risks are managed change, right? So we've always heard about basic cyber hygiene. I think that's going to become a part of the nomenclature um, when decision makers, when executives start to look at new opportunities. How do they shore up their ecosystem around enabling the business to make money, right? So I think a lot of the conversations are going to be, okay, are we safe um, because we've put the proper protocols, the basics in place, multi-factor authentication, the conversations around zero trust, right? In most cases, organizations have critical data or money that the bad guys are after. And I think there's going to be more granular controls around access, around identity, around specific workloads that are in cloud. Because as organizations make that transformation or that transition to cloud, those are going to be concerns that continue to bedevil decision makers, right? How do we ensure that we have the necessary fundamental baseline controls in place? and then we could start thinking about the other things. But I think shoring up the base, right? Education and awareness, those are things that are just going to become the normal part of doing business.
Exactly. So in everything, as I said before, there are the pros and the cons. But just thinking about the cons of all of this is the fact that it's a situation, for example, where you have, uh, for many persons, once they know that, for example, they have certain insurance in place, it's almost like all is well. I can drive my vehicle. If it gets stolen, I might get a replacement XYZ. So at times, persons might not go that extra effort to put in all that I can in terms of ensuring that things are safe. So I think what is happening in light of this is the fact that you have alluded to cyber hygiene. And based on experience, at times companies, organization, depending on the nature of the organization, their capabilities, they might not see the importance or they might not invest as much into ensuring that all the baselines are covered. So I think this will definitely push them into that direction where companies or organizations will start to value security more in terms of their organization, how things operate, the protection of their assets, data, put more emphasis there. So that in itself would then definitely provide some amount of mitigation or cushion to the various risks that exist. On the flip side, it has its benefits. I mean, so for sure.
Yeah, no, I think, and going back to that car analogy, I'm probably going to date myself, but I remember days when um, we would, I drove around in the car as a child without a seatbelt in someone's lap. The car didn't have a headrest, no airbags, right? But
Exactly.
right, but as the transition, right, in terms of managing auto liabilities, the government stepped in and mandated that, seat belts, it's the law. I remember a campaign saying, buckle up, tick it or click it, right? Companies start putting in airbags, safety measures really became a thing, right? Volvo used to be noted as the safest, things like that. And organizations that manufacture cars, they make it a part of their business model. I think the analogy holds true for the cyber industry, right? Um, let's say, you know, we don't we no longer have that the option of transferring the risk. I think the government will step in and enact laws. Wear your seatbelt, take it or click it from a security perspective, right? I think organizations will start beefing up their controls. They'll start making sure that the things they have in place, put an airbag in, put a headrest in, make sure people wear their seatbelt, have child seats, right? These are all things that evolved with the auto industry, and I think, again, I hate to predict, but I think if I were to, put on my prediction cap or pull out my crystal glass, I would say these are things that the similarity exists, and we could probably use that template. We could learn a lot from the auto industry or even beyond the airplane industry, where um, measures are put in place to ensure safety for all, not just myself as a driver, but for others on the street.
Yes, sure, exactly. Looking back at the article, though, is the fact that they made mention of uh, systemic risk in organizations. Um, can you share? I mean, a little more light on that issue of systemic risk?
Yeah, so systemic risk, right? Anything in the process that can harm, right? So systemic risk is usually steps in the process. Think of systemic risk as a domino effect, right? There are
Mhm.
specific things in the chain of events that could affect other things, right? So that is crucial. That is key. Understanding the importance and the impact of systemic risk. I think that's something that is again becoming very pronounced in conversations. I think I was in a QVT some class, and that topic came up where board members are starting to look at systemic risk. What are things that could harm the organization's ability to make money? So that is key, and I think you know you see organizations start to pay closer attention from a cyber perspective. There's specific things that you can address that would reduce the systemic risk to an acceptable level, right? Everything you do is going to involve risk, but the challenge is, are you able to calculate the risk and accept, right, the residual risk once you've put in the necessary controls, right? Is it at a level that you can afford that would enable you to sustain operations, right, and provide value to your customers?
Sure. Um, well, in light of the, the time though that we're looking at, just to kind of put everything into perspective, I mean, what's your final take on the this document? Is it something that companies or organizations should be overly concerned about? Is this something that we see happening anytime now in terms of insurance companies not wanting to take on that risk transfer? In the
I think
sense
it's
that organizations can remain relaxed to say we can take our time to continuously doing what we're doing until this is actually the reality.
no, I think organizations should take note. I mean, a carrier, such as Zurich, to make that type of bold statement regarding the transfer of risk. I don't think we should take it lightly. Um, while I was at Zurich, I remember having, and he mentioned it in the art. It was mentioned in the article, right? Mondelez suffered a ransomware attack, and Zurich took the posture that this is an act of war, right? Again, from an insurance perspective, insurance companies they have an incentive not to pay out, those claims. In addition, he mentioned that you know ransomware, we should encourage people not to pay ransomware. That's a whole nother podcast because you agree with that statement fundamentally until your data has been locked up. Right now, what do you do? Right? Yeah, I believe, but yeah, like Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Right? So
Exactly.
um, but I would say it's something you got to take it seriously, right? We didn't talk about the OFAC, which is I think the Offices of Foreign Assets Control, right? This is something that if an organization, for example, pay ransomware to the wrong entity, Iran, North Korea, Russia, people could actually go to jail for that. So I think all these things that we see, right? Zurich's hesitance to pay out a ransom, the government's controls that are in place to actually, um, I don't want to say inflict punishment, but to inflict punitive damages on organizations that pay ransom claims to the wrong organization. Those are all things that we should take note of, right? One of the things growing up in Jamaica, we said, right, life is a road that's full of signs, right? As you travel, there's signs on the road. These are indicators telling you, up here, coming up 5 miles. So I think you're going to turn left. You have to go to this destination. Why am I bringing that up? Is because these are all signs and indicators that this is something that we should not take lightly. If we disregard it, we disregard it at our peril. And it's good business practice anyway to have what we call, defense in depth. So yes, in addition to having insurance, transferring the risk, you should also mitigate. You should also make sure your people are aware. They have basic cyber intelligence. Do you have cyber hygiene? So I think I don't take it lightly. For one of the largest insurer in Europe and the U.S. for that matter, to make such a bold statement, I think it's something we should take note of. And as both as cyber practitioners, as people who study risk, and as organization, executive leadership. So I don't take his words lightly. And Mario, he's a very calculative individual. When he makes a statement, he's done his research. He knows what he's talking about. He has a sense and a feel for where things are going. And therefore, when he makes a statement like that, I wouldn't dismiss it. I would say take note of it, strengthen your defense, increase your understanding of risk mitigation, of risk transfer, of avoidance, or acceptance. Right? These are all things that when a risk professional tell you at the highest level of an organization, it shouldn't be taken lightly.
Very important note. And just to add to that, though, is the fact that if we do get to that point where insurers definitely do not want to take on that sort of a risk, then definitely companies or organizations need to take the necessary steps, as they have actually been reinforcing, to mitigate their own cyber risk. I mean, from all potential attacks. I mean, they could do a number of things,
Mhm.
right? Such as implementing robust cybersecurity measures, having their security programs in place, the firewalls, the intrusion detection system, the necessary policies in place that drives the necessary program. That's a whole nother discussion, talking about the importance of integrating policies in programs, because at times I recognize that policy is actually the glue or the driving force that makes programs effective in terms of their implementations. So this is something that companies, organizations need to think about as cybersecurity professionals, and also to drive this, communicate this effectively to the executives within the organization, which boils back to the fact that organizations definitely need to have that strong governance structure in place to facilitate these sort of conversations from the cybersecurity leaders to make these initiatives a reality. So, Chris, it was a pleasure, I mean, for us sharing this discussion. And no doubt there are many other things to talk about, many other articles to come in the coming weeks in this series. So,
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to additional articles and installment in the series. Great work. Again, we need more conversations like this to bring the topic, to bear, so we can all learn and grow and make the cybersecurity industry a safer place, as Eric Cole always say, a safer place to grow, raise a family, and thrive. Right. So, always excited to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Looking forward to future installments.
okay, sure. So there we have it, guys. Stay tuned for all future conversations on the CyberJA podcast.
All right. Cheers, everyone.